This is Tara Carr, Tara Talks, KDIV 98.7 FM, and I am joined with Evin Demirel, the author of African American Athletes in Arkansas, Muhammad Ali's Tour, Black Razorbacks, and Other Forgotten Stories. Welcome, Evin.
Thank you.
Glad to have you. So, Evin, this book... First of all, I did get a chance to read the book, really enjoyed it. It talks about African Americans in Arkansas, which is great to have that kind of touch the local aspect and their impact on sports. So it talks about football, basketball, baseball. So just tell me, what prompted you to write the book?
There's a few reasons, and number one, I'm a Little Rock Central high grad.
Okay.
So going to Little Rock Central during the 40th anniversary of the Central High crisis, there's a lot of discussion about public history and race relations and civil rights, and that was just par for the course in those hallways, in those classrooms. So it was very kind of natural to have that front and center.
Right.
For me, coming from that experience, and then I was huge into sports as well.
Yeah.
I've always been. So Joe Johnson was a player for us at Central. Then he goes to Arkansas, becomes a star here, and he's done very well in the NBA. So I've always had no problem essentially having interest in both realms. But it wasn't until years later when I was a reporter for the Democrat Gazette that I started to do stories about whites, blacks, doesn't matter, public history stories, where the more I got into people that were growing up in the 40s and 50s and 60s and exploring their lives and society as a whole, the more I realized there were these public history gaps, these disparities between African American communities and white communities that were out of whack with the population. Meaning, you would expect there to be some difference because fewer African Americans in Arkansas, but the differences were way out of whack with what the population difference was.
Okay. And so in your introduction, you say, why does a white guy like me or like yourself care about the history of African Americans? And I'm sure that's a question that you get either silently or out loud.
Or pre-taping.
Sure. What's your answer to that?
It's kind of, I guess, there's a Central High connection, right?
Sure.
There's some of that coming from Central High, that being my background. There's loving sports, and when we're talking about Arkansas, there's so many awesome, African American athletes in my favorite sport, basketball.
Yeah.
And so I care from that just sheer passion standpoint. But then the other, I think probably the most important thing is these socioeconomic reasons behind this public history gap that I'm talking about, where it's just a sense of fairness. Like, just because the state of Arkansas was giving black schools, all black schools and all black students and all black teachers, whatever it was, 1/10, 1/8 of the funding in the 1920s through 1960s that they were giving all white schools, just because that was happening, that meant that they couldn't afford to print yearbooks for those schools. And so where the all white schools could afford, and those counterparts were creating yearbooks, they were creating pieces of public history that now we can go back and we have that recorded. On the African American side, there's just gaps.
Yeah, lost history.
It's lost history, and it will be lost history, especially if the old timers who are still alive who remember that.
Yeah.
You don't go out there, you don't interview them before it's too late, before they pass away. So it's a sense of let's go ahead and see what we can do as far as filling in some of that gap, because I realize it's impossible to fill it up all the way.
Absolutely. So did you experience any challenges or pushback in your research for writing this book?
No pushback. I mean, for the most part, for entirely, people are willing to tell their stories.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter their race. They appreciate taking interest in their stories, their past. So no pushback at all. The challenges are, it is so difficult to find records of these all-black high schools pre-integration, from the 20s to 60s.
Yeah.
And this is in all spheres, not just sports, but all spheres. But
not just Arkansas.
Right, not just Arkansas, but across the South, it's a problem. But in Arkansas with sports, just to give you an example, what we have is currently the Arkansas Activity Association, which is the organizing governing body over high school sports, and they keep track of championships and champions dating back to the 1910s in certain sports. And if you look at that list of champions, you'll notice Central High, Fayetteville, Pine Bluff, these were all white schools up until the 1950s and 60s. You won't see Horace Mann or Dunbar or any of these schools on those lists because the official records as they currently exist cover only all white schools and only all white players when it comes to records pre-integration. They have not integrated the records yet because for the most part the records with all black schools are either lost, potentially destroyed, and there's a big question mark as to whether we'll ever be able to find them.
Wow. So what is your hope for this book, for the impact of this book?
I hope that it kind of twofold. Number one, that it would fill in some of this public history gap, and just from a sheer public history mission standpoint, I just feel like that's what should be done. Just period. And the Black History Commission gave me a grant to help with the book, and I really appreciate that. I would hope it adds some complexity, understanding of race relations in Arkansas. One of the stories is about these black Razorbacks of the 1920s through 1940s in Fayetteville who played against the all-white Fayetteville Bulldogs on the grounds of the U of A, even though it was segregated. And so that goes against what we're traditionally told was happening in society in the South. Like, there was not interracial football games. Yeah. It turns out, and not only in Arkansas, but I found out in Texas as well, and probably other states, this was happening kind of unofficially on the side. So add some of that nuance. And then also, I think it's possible to have reasoned, important, historically based, well-researched and sourced conversations about race and sports that are not always about the present. Yeah. This is 1970s and before for the most part.
Yeah. And so feedback from one of your readers is that this book highlights race relations between white and black people. And so can you elaborate on that? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, certainly. It's on the surface it says African American athletes in Arkansas, but it's really about Arkansas heritage race relations. It's blacks and whites and sports. Yeah. And so just as an example, I give for those black Razorbacks I was talking about, the story as we get it from our modern days, if you go to the old newspaper articles, you're getting them from white reporters or a white man named Arthur Friedman who was a Fayetteville High Bulldog in 1930, and he's writing from 1985 and remembering this team, and he's telling us how he befriended some of them because he grew up with them on the south side of Fayetteville. Yeah. And in the 10s and 20s they were playing football in the streets. And he's saying, even though, in society said they couldn't be, they could not compete officially, sports was a way for them to befriend each other. Yeah. In the 1930s, that is, in the South. And so, but he's a white, our narrator is white. We, unfortunately, I was not able to find any memoirs from the actual players themselves. Another interesting story comes from the 1960s, 50s through 70s, and it's about a guy named Dave McPherson and Chester Lane out of Little Rock. And Chester Lane is African American, Dave McPherson is a white man out of Little Rock, and it's they befriend each other, and it's McPherson who joins Chester Lane's team, which is predominantly African American, and together they form a team called the Hilarious Jesters, who goes and they play against all in front of all black crowds and all white crowds across central Arkansas. And it's interesting because McPherson is in this sense a reverse pioneer, right? He's breaking the divide in another way, right? And he talks about getting razzed by all black crowds and that kind of thing, and so it's both.
That's awesome. Yeah. And so Eddie Miles is quoted in the book as saying, "I think athletics has done more to bring races together than anything else." And you see that in movies. I love sports movies like Remember the Titans or Pride, even Bring It On. What are your thoughts on athletics having a positive impact on race relations? How do you see that through the context of this book?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at historically, when the law, meaning Jim Crow law, again, said officially you are not allowed to be on the same playing field as the other race. Like in Texas, they actually had a state law that forbade physical sports competition like swimming or football. And that was a state law at that time.
Yeah.
On top of the normal Jim Crow laws that we had throughout the South. When that's happening, you see a situation in which the youth, specifically the youth, says, no, that's not human nature. You know, when it comes to music, what I want to hear as far as big band, jazz, rock and roll, I'm going to go and I'm going to go hang out at these clubs and these bars where it's both races in music setting. And then in sports, it's also happening. With the males, for sure. Fortunately, we have so few records. It's probably happening with the females, but I don't even know because we have so few records about the females. But definitely with males, it's happening where unofficially, again, in North Little Rock, I'm getting stories that are told about in the mid-1940s, same interracial football being scrimmaged, where people are able to get to know each other on the football field where they otherwise would not have had an opportunity to get to know each other because society forbade them from being in the same workplace or in the same classroom setting.
So in the book, you focus on the unofficial 1930s, 40s Black Razorbacks. What impact do you think their history has on our current Black Razorbacks?
I find it interesting because this is a group of guys out of Fayetteville specifically who had roots in Fayetteville dating to probably the 1800s in some of their cases, who were playing in this league of all black football teams in this entire region against Joplin, against Fort Smith, Russellville, and there was no black college up here in that ever. And so instead of having black college teams or outside of Fort Smith, even all black high school teams, they had to have community teams. I think what that gave rise to a situation where the Ozarks specifically have an African American athletic heritage that has been totally forgotten and swept under the rug. And when it is brought up in certain sports circles that one of the reasons the Razorback football team currently is struggling is it is such a difficult recruiting job for the coaches to go to certain places in Alabama, Texas, even South Arkansas, and bring up guys to the Ozarks when there's a conception that this place is all hillbilly.
A misconception.
All hillbilly, all white, devoid of any African American heritage. Well, these are stories that say no, that there is some here. And here are some examples.
Absolutely. And I loved the story about Muhammad Ali's visit in 1969. Why do you think that visit to the University of Arkansas was so impactful?
I mean, that visit right there, so just kind of briefly, Ali at this point was the heavyweight champion of the world in the mid-60s. Then in 67, he refuses to fight in the Vietnam despite being drafted, and he does so on religious grounds. He is a part of the Nation of Islam at this point. He is a black Muslim, and specifically in this era under Elijah Muhammad, black Muslims are pro-segregation. Now, not in the same way that the Ku Klux, for the same reasons the Ku Klux Klan was or is, but the same result. And so a guy who is representing these kinds of ideas stepping into Arkansas, as you can imagine, was getting a lot of pushback from some of the all-white power structures and the businessmen out of Pulaski County, as well as some state senators. It was phrased in different ways than it would be today, but essentially they were accusing him of being communist. Communist inspired and all this. And I thought it was important to point out that what Ali was doing when he was coming with those kinds of ideas into the state was twofold. Two things happened. Number one, even though the state senators tried to bully him and ban him from talking at the U of A, guys like President David Mullins stood up, said, no, this is what a university is supposed to be about, free-flowing ideas. We're going to have controversial speakers. And so he you had the administrator stand up for the right thing. So I thought that was really good. But secondly, what Ali was doing was not bringing into Arkansas these like exotic ideas from Detroit and from Chicago and from these faraway places, but he was bringing these evolved black nationalist philosophies and ideas that had been in Arkansas in the East and the Delta since the 1800s.
Right.
It just had evolved in different ways.
Yeah. Interesting. And so why do you think it's so important to share these forgotten stories?
I would say number one, it's just to preserve public history. Before the old timers that who remember what it was like before they die. Let's just get it down. It doesn't have to be in a book form, but if this book can be an inspiration for students to go out there and to do their own public history recordings and turn it into article, turn it into class credit, that in itself would be like a major push for me. But I also want to serve as a beachhead. I know there are a lot of Texans here in Fayetteville, and I've found stories that say, oh, there's similar things are happening at UT Austin, where you had all black teams playing against the Longhorns in '44. So I want to be a way to let's start this conversation not just for Arkansas, but spread it throughout the state.
Absolutely.
Throughout the South.
That's awesome. And where can our listeners find your book, Evin?
Definitely. You can just Google African American athletes in Arkansas, Amazon. It's in the U of A bookstore, Barnes & Noble, Fayetteville, Nightbird. And you can go to my website, heritageofsports.com, but many different ways.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, thank you. Thank you for having me, Darren.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, Evin, thank you so much for your time and joining us today. Remember, Evin Demirel, will be at the University of Arkansas on Wednesday, October 18th in room 103 in the Hyper building. This event is free and open to the public. This is Tara Carr with Tara Talks, KDIV 98.7 FM.
6 p.m.
Voice of Diversity, voice of the city.